They built an entire community on my family's lake and told me I was trespassing. I didn't go looking for a fight. But the morning I drove up that old Wyoming road and found a massive HOA gate blocking my own inheritance, something in me knew this wasn't a mistake. The smiles were too polished, the paperwork too convenient, and the stories didn't match the land I remembered. So I did what any man would do when a lie tries to bury the truth. I pushed back. And that's when their whole operation began to crack. The call came just after sunrise, when the Wyoming wind was still soft, and the lake country hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to be warm or cold. I was tightening the last hinge on a storage shed behind my small rental house when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number, Cheyenne area code. I almost let it ring out. Most calls from that region were sales pitches or county notices, but something about the timing made me wipe my hands on my jeans and answer. "Mr. Remy Cole?" a woman asked, her voice steady, professional, but soft around the edges. "This is attorney Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandfather, Henry Cole." For a moment, my throat closed. My grandfather had been gone for years, but his name still carried the smell of pine resin and campfire smoke. I cleared my voice. "Yes, ma'am. What about it?" There was a short, careful pause. One attorneys use when they know they're about to drop something heavy on someone. "Mr. Cole, you've inherited 1,200 acres of lake property in northern Wyoming, deeded, surveyed, and paid in full, and the transfer of ownership has now been finalized." The wrench slipped from my hand and clattered on the plywood floor. I stared out at the morning light shimmering off the sagebrush, trying to place the number she'd said. 1,200 acres. My grandfather had mentioned owning a little lake place once, decades ago, but I'd always assumed it meant a hunting cabin or a few acres of shoreline, not nearly 2 square miles of land. There was something else in Sarah's tone, too, an edge, a warning almost. Before I could ask, she continued, "I strongly recommend you visit the property today, Mr. Cole, in person. There are developments you need to see with your own eyes." That was all she had to say. 3 hours later, I was driving my old F-150 north along a gravel county road, dust rising behind me like a second horizon. Each mile pulled me deeper into country that felt older than time. Rolling hills, whispering pines, an air so clean and thin it almost stung your lungs. If my grandfather ever loved anything more than quiet land, I hadn't known about it. He spent his life building small dams and irrigation lines across Wyoming and Montana. Men like him didn't talk much. They didn't brag. They built things that stayed. And now, somehow, all of it belonged to me. The road narrowed and dipped toward a valley. My GPS pinged and glowed blue, signaling the coordinates Sarah had emailed. I expected a dirt path running along a tree line, maybe an old cabin leaning into the wind, maybe the abandoned foundation of one of Grandpa's old projects. But what I saw instead made my foot ease off the gas. A massive timber arch stretched across the road, thick logs stacked into the shape of a gatehouse, freshly stained wood, decorative steel pine cones dangling from chains. A slab of polished cedar in the center read in bold carved letters, "Lakeshore Pines Community Private HOA Property. No trespassing." I rolled to a stop, gravel crunching under my tires. This wasn't just a gate. It was a statement. Behind the arch stood a guard shack, real glass windows, stone base, metal roof, and inside was a man in a Navy uniform, radio clipped to his shoulder, who stepped out as soon as he saw my truck idling there. He approached with a posture that said he'd done this 1,000 times, one hand up, palm out, the other resting near his belt. He didn't look angry, just certain of where he was, certain of his authority, certain that I didn't belong. "Morning, sir," he said, leaning slightly toward my window without fully bending. This is a private residential community. Do you have a resident pass or a guest authorization? For a moment, I couldn't speak. My grandfather's land, my land, was supposed to be untouched wilderness, a place where the wind wrote the only rules. And yet here I was, staring at a gate that looked like the entrance to a high-end mountain resort. I forced my voice steady. I'm here to access the Cole property. The guard blinked once, slow. Cole property? Sir, there's no Cole property here. This entire valley is part of Lakeshore Pines HOA. You'll need to turn around. I reached into the console and pulled out the manila envelope Sarah had given me. Inside it, the deed she'd signed over that very morning. I held it up so he could see the seal catching the light. This land, I said quietly, belonged to my grandfather, and as of today, it belongs to me. The guard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Irritation or uncertainty, I couldn't tell. He straightened up and crossed his arms. Sir, he said more firmly, I'm telling you that you're currently trespassing on HOA property. If you don't have authorization, you cannot proceed past this point. A gust of wind swept through the valley then, cold, carrying the scent of lake water and distant pine. It tugged at my jacket, at the edge of the gatehouse sign, at something buried deep in my chest. I stepped out of the truck slowly, letting my boots settle into the dirt. The afternoon sun glinted off the wood beams above me, casting long shadows across the road. I stared at that gate, at the mark of authority carved into what should have been open land. For a long moment, all I could think was that my grandfather's footprints had once rested in this dirt. His hands had worked this soil. His sweat had salted this valley. And now there was a uniformed stranger telling me that I didn't belong here. Shock settled into my bones. Then anger. Cold, quiet, measured anger. Tell me something, I said, keeping my tone level. Who authorized this gate? The guard didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his radio, and as the static crackled to life, I realized something so sharp and clear, it felt like a blade pressing against my ribs. Whatever happened here, whatever this HOA thought they owned, whatever lines they believed they could redraw, they had built their entire world on land that wasn't theirs, and I intended to find out exactly how far they'd gone. The guard spoke into his radio, murmuring something I couldn't catch over the wind pushing through the pines. His words were clipped, formal, like someone reporting an intruder at a federal facility, not a man standing in front of the rightful owner of the valley. When he finished, he lowered the radio and gave me a look that was half warning, half irritation. Stay right here, sir. The HOA office wants to speak with you. He didn't ask if I wanted to speak with them. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't even pretend to check the deed I was holding in my hand. He acted like the gate outranked everything. History, paperwork, bloodline, and maybe for a while it had. A buzzing sound broke through my thoughts as the gate's steel arms shuddered, then swung open with a slow, mechanical groan. Behind the guard shack, a paved road curved into the valley, the asphalt slick and dark like it had been poured recently. On either side of it, rows of cabins stood in perfect symmetry, picture-perfect structures with big glass windows facing the lake and manicured gravel paths winding around them. Cabins on my grandfather's land. I climbed back into my truck and followed the guard's gesture to proceed. As I rolled forward, the sign overhead cast a long shadow across my hood. Private HOA property. I could almost hear my grandfather scoff at the idea. The man stayed clear of towns whenever he could. Said too many rules made people forget how to think straight. About half a mile in, the road widened, revealing a split-rail fence and a wooden lodge perched on a hill above the water. It looked nothing like my grandfather's world. This place had been designed by someone with a big budget and a bigger ego. Timber beams stained a rich chestnut, stacked stone pillars, a wraparound deck lined with black iron lanterns. It didn't belong to the land. It dominated it. I parked beside a spotless SUV with an HOA sticker on the windshield. The air here smelled like sun-warmed cedar and lake water, but underneath it was the metallic tang of something else. Fresh construction, machinery, a manufactured version of nature. Inside the lodge, the temperature dropped a dozen degrees, cooled by industrial AC humming overhead. A young woman at a reception desk looked up, her smile bright but strained. It was the smile of someone trained to greet visitors while silently wondering if they belonged there. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I was told the HOA president wanted to see me." Her eyes flicked to the deed tucked under my arm, then back to my face. Her smile stiffened. "One moment, please." She disappeared down a hallway, her soft footfalls fading into the hum of fluorescent lighting. I stood there, letting the scent of polished wood and citrus cleaner settle around me. On the wall hung framed photos of smiling families, fishing off docks I recognized from my grandfather's old maps, catch and release, barbecues, kayak races. All those photos were built on a lie. "Mr. Cole?" The voice came from behind me, measured, bright, confident. I turned to see a woman in her mid-50s standing on the staircase landing above the lobby. She descended with the smooth assurance of someone who gave orders more often than she took them. Silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat twist, fitted navy blazer, pearl earrings that caught the light in small flashes. She extended a hand that somehow managed to be both polite and condescending. "I'm Bethany Reed, president of the Lakeshore Pines Homeowners Association. I understand you're having some confusion about the boundaries of our community." I didn't take her hand. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just a fraction. "There's no confusion," I said. "My grandfather's deed covers this valley, the lake, and everything surrounding it. I came to see what condition the property is in, and instead I found a gate across the only road in." Her expression softened into a look people use when they're about to call someone naive. "Mr. Cole, I'm afraid you've been given outdated documents. This development has existed for almost a decade. Our survey, approved by the county, shows that your family's property ends several hundred feet south of here." She gestured toward a wall-mounted map behind the reception desk. It displayed the valley in bold colors, HOA parcels in green, common areas in blue, and the lake in an even brighter shade of turquoise. According to that map, the lake barely touched my grandfather's land. I stepped closer. "Where's the original shoreline?" I asked. Bethany clasped her hands, her nails clicking softly. "This is the official survey, Mr. Cole." "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched for a beat too long. Then she gave a small laugh, airy and dismissive. "Well, shorelines shift over time. Water levels change. Erosion happens. These things are natural." But she said natural the way someone says acceptable inconvenience, like the land itself had rearranged to accommodate her development. I looked again, really looked, at the blue on the map. The waterline was crisp, too crisp. The curves smooth and stylized, like someone had traced them with a tablet pen over a template, rather than on muddy ground with stakes and survey tape. And then I noticed it. The angle of the North Shore. It bent in a way I had never seen on any of the hydrology maps I'd studied as a kid, sitting beside my grandfather's drafting table. The lake didn't naturally curve like that. Not in this valley. "You said this was approved by the county?" I asked. "Of course." She smiled again. "Everything here is entirely legal." Entirely legal. The phrase felt like a splinter under my skin. I reached into my envelope and pulled out the deed. I laid it flat on the counter, smoothing the edges. The old paper, yellowed and creased, bore my grandfather's name in ink that had faded but not surrendered to time. "This is the legal boundary," I said. Bethany leaned in just enough to show she didn't respect what she was looking at. Old paperwork. Things change. Properties shift. The county updates boundaries to reflect modern use. Modern use. A lake that had existed since before the town was founded. A water system built by my grandfather's hands. A valley that hadn't shifted an inch since the last glacier melted. "Your survey doesn't match this deed," I said quietly. She straightened, her smile tightening like a noose. "Mr. Cole, perhaps you're not familiar with how developments work, but I assure you, everything here has been handled properly, and we cannot have people wandering into the community without authorization. Residents value their privacy." "I'm not wandering," I said. "I'm on my land." Her smile vanished. For the first time, she looked directly at me. Not at the deed, not at my clothes, not at my truck outside. She looked at me like she was trying to evaluate how much of a threat I was. "Mr. Cole," she said slowly, "if you disrupt this community, you will find that the residents here are protective. They don't take kindly to outsiders making accusations." I held her stare. "I'm not an outsider." Something flickered in her eyes again. Annoyance, maybe. Or fear. Or the sudden realization that the man standing in her lodge wasn't confused at all. I folded the deed carefully and tucked it back under my arm. Without a word, I turned and walked out. The cold air hit me like a slap as the lodge door closed behind me. The sky above the lake was a deep, impossible blue, the kind you only see in high mountain country. A breeze pushed ripples across the water, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone. It should have been peaceful, but nothing about this place felt peaceful. I stood there on the gravel, staring out at the cabins lining the lakefront. A dozen thoughts churned in my mind, each one sharper than the last. If their survey was real, why didn't the shoreline match historical maps? If their development was legal, why had Sarah sounded worried? If their authority was legitimate, why had Bethany relied on intimidation instead of documentation? I didn't have answers yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Those cabins weren't sitting on land that belonged to them. I drove out of the valley with my jaw clenched so tight it ached. The afternoon light was sinking behind the ridgeline, stretching long shadows across the dirt road. Every bump in the gravel rattled the papers in the passenger seat. The deed, the survey copies Sarah had emailed me, and a stack of brittle old documents my grandfather had left behind. They rustled like dry leaves in a storm, whispering the truth that nobody in that HOA wanted to hear. By the time I reached the turnout overlooking the lake, the wind had cooled. The sky had turned that pale winter blue color that only happens in high country. I parked the truck facing the water and shut off the engine. Silence wrapped around me. No cars, no voices, just the soft hiss of wind brushing through pine needles. I opened the envelope again. The deed was older than I remembered, faded, folded so many times the creases had nearly split. My grandfather's signature, steady, looping, unmistakably his, sat beside a county seal from 1963. I traced the ink with my thumb, remembering the way he used to sit at his kitchen table sharpening pencils for his engineering drawings. He'd built half the small dams in this region, none of them flashy, all of them steady. The kind of structures meant to last longer than the men who drew them. He never talked much about owning land, but he talked a lot about keeping it. I set the deed aside and pulled out the hydrology maps from the envelope. These weren't casual sketches. They were stamped by the State Water Board, meticulously drawn diagrams showing flow rates, shoreline curves, emergency spillways. My grandfather had updated them all the way through the 80s. When I laid the HOA map beside his, the difference hit me like a punch. Their map curved inward, where the shoreline should bulge outward. Their lake levels were too shallow for the natural depth lines drawn decades prior. Even the spillway on their map looked like it had been invented out of thin air. No erosion changes lake shapes like that, and no natural shift moves a shoreline 200 feet. I steadied myself against the dashboard, breathing slow. Pieces were sliding into place. Uncomfortable pieces, the kind you wished weren't true but knew you couldn't ignore. The HOA hadn't just marked the land wrong. They had redrawn the lake itself. I flipped to another document, a yellowing folder marked Water Rights. Priority. My grandfather had kept everything neat, tape-smoothed edges, handwritten notes in the margins with dates, coordinates, even rainfall patterns. As a kid, I'd once asked why he kept so many papers, and he'd replied without looking up from his drafting board, because people forget the truth when it's convenient. Paper doesn't. I pulled out the top sheet. State of Wyoming Water Rights. Certificate Priority Date 1960. Holder Henry J. Cole. Priority water rights weren't something you could fake, and they sure weren't something an HOA could rewrite because it wanted a lake view. I leaned back in the seat, letting the truth settle like silt in deep water. My grandfather's land wasn't just scenic acreage. It wasn't just a lake. It was a functioning water system, a regulated, documented, state-protected asset, which meant anyone interfering with it, anyone diverting it, anyone building over its infrastructure, wasn't just trespassing. They were violating state law, and they either didn't know that, or worse, they did. The cold wind pressed through the open truck window. I reached into my duffel and pulled out the old leather notebook my grandfather always carried. Its cracked cover felt familiar, grounding. Inside were sketches, water flow notes, and an entry dated June 1972. If something ever happens to me, whoever gets this land needs to remember one thing. Water doesn't lie. People do. My throat tightened. Outside the truck, the sky darkened, brushing the lake in tones of steel and silver. A few cabin lights flickered to life across the water, warm squares glowing against the encroaching dusk. Families settling in for dinner. Kids probably tossing pebbles off their rented dock. People enjoying a peaceful evening built on a foundation of stolen ground. I wasn't angry at them. Not yet. They didn't know. They couldn't know. But Bethany knew something. The confidence she wore wasn't ignorance. It was certainty. Certainty that the story she'd built would outshine the truth buried in the dirt. That a polished lodge and a row of expensive cabins could erase the decades of my family's work. I turned on the dome light and studied the HOA survey more closely. The boundaries didn't just shift. They shifted in straight lines, geometric angles that followed development convenience rather than topography. You could see where they nudged property lines to fit the marina footprint, where they narrowed Remy Cole's land to widen their lake access, where they framed everything to look legal to someone who didn't know better, someone who didn't understand water, someone who hadn't been raised by an engineer. As the wind picked up, I opened the last folder in the stack. Inside were 4 old black and white photos of my grandfather standing beside the lake's original spillway. He wasn't smiling, but he looked proud. His posture straight, his boots planted in the mud like he owned not just the land, but the responsibility that came with it. He never built anything halfway, and he sure as hell didn't build this for a homeowners association. I shut the envelope decisively and started the truck. The engine growled to life, vibrating through the steering wheel. Tomorrow, I'd bring these documents to Sarah. Tomorrow, I'd get the county records. Tomorrow, I'd start pulling every thread. But tonight, I just needed one last look. I stepped out of the truck and walked to the ridge where the land dipped toward the valley. The air was colder here, sharp enough to sting. Below me, the HOA cabins glowed like tiny outposts of borrowed luxury. The water reflected those lights in wavering ribbons. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was a weight in my chest, a mix of grief, anger, and something colder underneath. Not vengeance. Not yet. Resolve, because standing there, watching the wind ripple across a lake my grandfather built with his own hands, I understood something with painful clarity. They hadn't stolen a view. They hadn't stolen a property. They'd stolen a legacy. And if they thought I would walk away quietly, they didn't know a damn thing about the man who raised me. Morning broke cold and sharp over the valley, the kind of Wyoming dawn that felt like it had teeth. Frost clung to the grass, glittering pale blue under a sky still deciding whether to warm up or stay stubbornly winter. I stood outside my truck, thermos steaming in my hand, waiting for Sarah Mitchell to pull up. She arrived 5 minutes early, typical Sarah. A dark SUV rolled to a stop beside me, and she stepped out with a leather briefcase and her hair tied back in a clean, no-nonsense knot, the kind of presence that quietly announced she didn't waste time. "You look like you slept in that truck," she said, eyeing the open folders on my hood. "I might have," I admitted. "Had a lot to go through." She didn't ask more. Sarah wasn't the prying type. She joined me at the hood, tapping her nails lightly against the deed I'd weighted down with a thermos. "Show me what you found." I spread out the documents: grandfather's hydrology maps, the 50-year chain of water rights, the spillway sketch, the topographical overlays. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she examined each sheet. She didn't speak, didn't breathe loudly, didn't show emotion. She merely absorbed every detail the way a surgeon studies a scan before an operation. Finally, she lifted her chin. "Remy, this isn't just a bad survey." She tapped the HOA map with the end of her pen. "This is fabricated. They moved the water boundary. They drew in a shoreline that fits their development footprint. They erased half the old spillway. And look here. This depth line?" She slid the map closer to me. "That's impossible without dredging." I exhaled a long, slow breath. "So they knew." "They either knew," she said, "or they paid someone who did." We folded everything back into the envelope and drove toward the HOA office. The morning sun had climbed higher, bringing out the lake's cold, mirror-like surface. From a distance, the cabins looked almost peaceful, like a painting someone would hang in a dentist's office. But underneath that postcard calm, I could feel the wrongness humming like a faulty wire. The moment we parked in front of the lodge, the front door swung open. Jake Mercer stepped out. I'd never met him before, but I recognized the type instantly. Developer slick from boots to haircut, mid-40s, suntanned, wearing a vest that probably cost more than my truck payment. His smile was confident, but too polished, too staged, as if he practiced it in the mirror before greeting new investors. "Morning," he said, as if we were old friends and he wasn't standing on stolen ground. "You must be the Cole fellow causing all the commotion." I didn't shake his hand. He didn't seem surprised. Sarah stepped up beside me. "Good morning. We're here to review the survey records and request copies of all boundary documentation filed since 2015. Jake laughed, sharp, dismissive. "Oh, so it's that kind of visit." "Yes," Sarah replied calmly. "It is." He walked a slow circle around us, hands in his vest pockets, eyes on the lake. "You know, this place sat empty for years, completely untouched, nothing but brush and mud. No one cared, nobody used it. We did something with it." He gestured toward the cabins, the marina, the paved road. "We made it a community." "A community built on my client's property," Sarah said. Jake's smile faltered for the first time, just slightly. "That's debatable." "It's not," I said, pulling out the deed. "This is the line. Everything north of it belongs to me." He glanced at the paper the way someone glances at a parking ticket, annoyed, not threatened. Old deeds can be superseded. Land shifts. Rivers move. Sarah leaned forward, voice low and steady. Not this lake, not this shoreline, and certainly not in a way that conveniently creates space for 47 cabins and a marina. His jaw tightened. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled through the pine branches overhead, scattering needles across the ground. A fishing boat drifted across the lake, the tiny engine humming like a distant wasp, and from somewhere behind us came the faint ringing of a hammer, construction continuing on a lake they didn't own. Jake stepped closer, dropping the friendly act entirely. "Let me be blunt," he said. "The people living here? They're not going anywhere. This place is their home. They bought it fair and square. They'll fight you if they have to. So before you go digging into old paperwork, ask yourself, do you really want to pick that fight?" I didn't flinch. "I'm not picking a fight, Jake. I'm defending land my grandfather protected for 60 years. His eyes darkened. "Then you're in for a long year, Cole." Sarah cut in before he could say more. "We'll take those documents now." He didn't agree. He didn't refuse. He simply walked back into the lodge without looking over his shoulder, like a man who believed he still had the upper hand because he'd gotten away with something long enough to trust his own lie. Inside the office, the tension thickened. A receptionist reluctantly pulled out a drawer of maps, permits, and survey images. Sarah flipped through them with increasing intensity. Most were printed recently, too recently for a development nearly 10 years old. A few were missing signatures. One had a county stamp that looked pixelated, as if copied and pasted. When she reached the last sheet, she froze. "Remy," she whispered, "look at this." It was the original HOA survey, the one Bethany showed me. Except this version had something the public version didn't. A faint rectangle on the north side of the lake. Faded, almost erased, but still visible if you looked closely. The footprint of my grandfather's spillway. It had been there all along. They had deliberately drawn over it. The evidence was right beneath their ink. I felt the shift in my chest, a familiar one. The moment when confusion gives way to clarity. The moment when doubt stiffens into resolve. Sarah slid the paper into her briefcase, her voice steady but electric. "They falsified this survey, Remy. This isn't just sloppy paperwork. This is intentional." I nodded slowly. "I know." "And if they falsified a survey," she continued, "there's a good chance the county approval involved someone looking the other way." I leaned back, letting the truth settle like heavy dust. They hadn't just stolen the land. They'd rewritten it, bent its shape, erased its infrastructure, and built their houses on top of the lie. Outside, the sun glinted off the lake, bright, sharp, unbothered. Water doesn't lie. My grandfather's old words echoed through my head, but people do. I looked at Sarah. "So what's our move?" She closed her briefcase with a click that sounded like the beginning of a war. "We give them rope, Remy," she said, "and we let them hang themselves with their next mistake." I stepped outside into the wind, staring across the valley at the cabins perched like borrowed crowns. They still thought this land belonged to them. They still believed their paperwork could outrun the truth. They still had no idea how deep this went. But they would. Soon. The temperature dropped sharply as the sun slipped behind the ridge, dragging long shadows across the lake like fingers pulling a curtain closed. Sarah headed back toward town to start drafting the first set of filings. I stayed behind. I needed time alone on the land, my land, to let the weight of what we discovered settle in my mind. The lake was quiet at dusk, the water flattening into a sheet of glass, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish near the surface. From across the valley, I could see the HOA cabins lighting up one by one, warm amber squares reflecting off the lake. The scene should have been peaceful. It should have been comforting. Instead, It looked like a colony of trespassers settling in for the night. I parked my truck along the dirt road and walked toward the old trailhead that once led to my grandfather's cabin. The air was crisp enough to sting my nose. Pine needles crunched under my boots, the faint scent of sap mixing with the cold. I half expected to find some trace of his marker stones, the ones he always used to border footpaths and mark survey points. But nothing remained. It was as if someone had smoothed the land with a giant hand. I exhaled, long and slow. My grandfather had spent decades walking this shoreline, maintaining the system he built. And in a few short years, the HOA had bulldozed over history as if it were topsoil. My phone buzzed in my pocket, vibrating steadily. Once, twice, then a rapid series of alerts that made the hairs on my arms rise. Reception was spotty out here, so when the signal held long enough to deliver 10 notifications at once, it meant something was happening. I unlocked the screen. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then the reality hit me like a blow. Comments, posts, mentions, dozens of them. A public HOA Facebook group had posted a message about me, my name, the fact that I stormed into their office claiming ownership of community property, and a warning for residents to remain vigilant. I read one line twice just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. This man is attempting to defraud our community. He is not the rightful owner. He is dangerous and should not be approached. Dangerous. A threat. A fraud. They weren't just defensive. They'd gone on offense. My pulse ticked up, but my mind stayed steady. Panic never helped anyone. My grandfather had taught me that too. He used to say that when a storm barrels down a valley, everyone runs except the people who understand wind patterns. They duck behind the right rock, wait for the gust to pass, and come out standing. I scrolled through the comments. Some were confused, but most were angry. Angry at a stranger they'd never met. Angry at the idea of losing cabins they'd been told were legally theirs. Angry because the HOA had handed them a villain. I realized something then. Bethany wasn't stupid. She was faster than I expected. She was shaping a narrative before I could present the truth. Turning the entire community against me was her first move, and she played it early, loud, and with confidence. I kept scrolling. The posts got worse. A blurry photo of me walking near the lodge. A caption calling me an agitator. People speculating about what kind of scam I was running. A few old-timers swearing they would defend the community if needed. None of it was overtly violent, but the undertones buzzed like a live wire. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A resident had posted, "We should confront him. HOA can't do everything alone." 6 people liked it. 2 commented that they were standing by. My throat tightened. I looked around the valley, scanning the tree line and the road. Night had fallen fast, wrapping the land in a velvet darkness broken only by cabin lights scattered like sparks around the shore. But it didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt like eyes might be watching. I walked back to my truck, the gravel crunching louder than before. I started the engine, headlights cutting through the shadows as I drove toward the base of the valley. My phone buzzed again, this time with a new alert that made my skin prickle. "Unknown number. We know what you're trying to do, back off." Another came seconds later. "You're not welcome here." I didn't reply. My grandfather had warned me about people who operate in packs. They're loud until they're confronted with someone who doesn't flinch. Still, I wasn't foolish. A man alone in the dark, facing a community that believed he was the enemy. That was how bad stories started. I drove straight to the small rental cabin I'd taken near the outskirts of town. The place was modest. Bare floors, thin walls, the smell of old pine soaked into the beams. But it was safe. I double-checked the locks before setting my papers on the kitchen table. Then I set up cameras. One pointed at the front door, another at the window. a motion sensor at the porch. Not because I expected violence. Wyoming folks weren't usually that kind of people. But because fear made good people reckless, and lies made them desperate. When everything was in place, I called one person, Marcus Hale. If there was anyone in this county who knew when lines were being crossed, and who'd speak up even if it made enemies, it was Marcus. He'd been sheriff here for 15 years, and he'd known my grandfather even longer. He answered on the third ring. "Remy? Haven't heard from you in a while." His voice was warm, worn in like old leather. "I need to talk to you," I said. "HOA trouble." A low whistle filtered through the speaker. "Lord, son, I've been hearing things. You okay?" "For now. They've gone public against me, posting threats, painting me as a scammer." "Already?" He sounded almost impressed. "That fast?" "They're scared," I said. "And a scared HOA is a loud HOA." He paused. "I'll stop by tomorrow, early." "Thanks, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet," he murmured. "HOA fights get ugly in these parts. Folks get territorial over things they shouldn't." He hung up after promising to bring coffee and whatever documentation he had access to. I set the phone down, listening to the old cabin creak as the temperature dropped outside. The heater clicked on, blowing dry, warm air across the room. For the first time all day, exhaustion settled into my bones. I sat at the table in the quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp reflecting off the deed beside my elbow. My grandfather's signature stared back at me, steady, neat, unwavering. I remembered him sitting on a porch overlooking this same lake, long before cabins and marinas stole the horizon. He used to say that land wasn't something you owned. It was something you guarded, because someday someone would try to take it. And tonight, reading those threats, seeing how quickly lies spread, feeling the pressure of an entire community turning its gaze toward me, I realized he'd been right. This wasn't just about boundaries, wasn't just about maps, wasn't even just about the lake. It was about protecting something that was mine by right, by work, by legacy, and doing it the way he taught me, quietly, carefully, lawfully. The people shouting online didn't bother me. The threats didn't scare me. And Bethany's arrogance didn't shake me. If anything, all of it made one thing clear. They were already losing control of their own story. And they knew it. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness except for the moonlight spilling through the window. Somewhere far off, across the valley, a dog barked. Somewhere closer, a pine branch snapped beneath the weight of wind. The world went quiet again. But underneath that quiet, something new was growing. Steady, sharp, unbreakable. Resolve. Morning arrived wrapped in a thin white fog that clung low to the grass and drifted lazily across the dirt road. Wyoming mornings had a way of reminding you that nothing here was permanent. Not the weather, not the warmth, not even the ground beneath your boots. But today, that shifting silence felt different, more like anticipation than uncertainty. I stepped outside just as headlights cut through the mist. A county sheriff's truck rumbled up the gravel, tires crunching over frost. Marcus Hale climbed out, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee like a man who'd learned long ago that caffeine solved more problems than conversation ever could. "Thought you'd need this," he said, handing me one. "Had a feeling yesterday wasn't going to sit quiet." "That obvious, huh?" "You forget I knew your grandfather," he said, arching a brow. "Coal men don't drive 8 miles into town after dark, unless something's bad, or about to get worse." I managed a tired half-smile and motioned him inside. The cabin's heater hummed softly, pushing warm air across the room. Papers lay scattered across the kitchen table. Deeds, hydrology maps, survey overlays, Sarah's notes printed in her crisp handwriting. Marcus set his hat on a chair and studied the pile. "I'll be honest with you," he said, voice dropping low. "I heard talk years back that a developer was sniffing around this valley. Never paid it much mind. Figured it was just rumor." "It wasn't rumor," I said, sliding the HOA map toward him. "It was the beginning." He leaned forward, his weathered hands flattening the map against the table, his brows knit together as he traced the shoreline with a finger. "This ain't right. The North Bank didn't look like this even 10 years ago." "Exactly," I said. "They shifted it, redrew everything to fit their footprint." He shook his head. "Lord Almighty, Bethany and that board have been strutting around like they built this lake themselves." I pulled out the water rights certificate and handed it to him. He read it slowly, carefully, like a man who understood the gravity of official ink. "Priority rights," he murmured. "Your granddad had 'em before half the towns in this county even put up a post office." "And those rights don't disappear," I said. "Not with new surveys, not with new developments, not with HOA bylaws." Marcus rubbed a hand over his face. "I'll tell you something else. This lake feeds half the valley. Irrigation lines, cattle pastures. Even the fire department fills their tanker here sometimes. If that HOA's messed with the flow rate or moved the spillway, hell, if they've done anything to tamper with inflow or outflow, that's not civil law. That's the state's jurisdiction." That's what Sarah said. "Then she's a smart woman." The sheriff stood, grabbed his hat, and motioned for me to follow him outside. The fog had lifted a little, revealing the soft glimmer of the lake far beyond the ridge. "Come on," he said. "I want to show you something." We drove to a narrow trail leading down toward the valley's south edge. The ground was cold underfoot, and the air smelled like wet soil. As we approached a cluster of old pines, Marcus stopped and pointed through the branches. "There," he said. "That used to be your granddad's monitoring station. Nothing fancy, just a concrete base, a few gauges, and a little lean-to he built to protect it from hail. But that thing stood for 40 years. "What happened to it?" I asked, though part of me already knew. He pushed branches aside. In its place was a smooth patch of graded earth, fresh gravel, construction tire tracks. Gone, erased, like it had never existed. A slow heat climbed up my chest. Anger, grief, disbelief all tangled together. My grandfather had taken me to that station when I was 9. I remembered the way he knelt beside me, guiding my hand as I measured water flow using the old gauge. I remembered the pride in his eyes when I got the numbers right. And now it was gone. Paved over. Silenced. "They bulldozed it," Marcus said quietly. "Didn't file a report. Didn't tell the county. Didn't ask permission from anyone." I swallowed hard. Why would they destroy a monitoring station unless they didn't want anyone noticing the changes they made, he finished. The wind picked up, rustling the pine needles above us. I felt the weight of the valley in that moment, the hidden infrastructure, the ecosystem my grandfather had spent half his life nurturing. None of it was glamorous. None of it made headlines. But it mattered. It kept cattle fed, crops watered, families living. And the HOA had treated it like backyard clutter. We walked back to the trucks in silence. When we reached the road, Marcus turned to me, voice steady. "You're not dealing with a simple boundary dispute, Remy. This isn't just paperwork or a gate in the wrong place. They altered a water system that feeds an entire valley. That's state level, maybe federal." I nodded slowly. I figured as much. "You need to loop in the Wyoming Water Resources Department," he continued. "You and Sarah should get everything ready. Maps, photos, rights certificates. If the state confirms interference, that HOA is in for the fight of its life." I stared toward the lake, watching the sunlight pierce the last of the fog and scatter across the water like shards of glass. Beautiful, cold, and indifferent, just like it had been long before any homes were built along its shore. "I'll do it," I said. "We'll file everything." Marcus clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Good. And while you're doing that, keep your head down. Folks in that community are stirred up. HOA's painted you as the villain. I know. Don't engage with them. Don't argue. Don't react. Just stay quiet and let Sarah handle the legal side. The louder they get, the more foolish they'll look when the truth comes out." Quiet. That part I could do, but quiet didn't mean passive. Quiet meant watching, recording, documenting, letting arrogance pile its own evidence. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was climbing high, warming the frost into droplets that slid down the window glass in shimmering lines. I spread out the documents again, organizing them by date, by category: hydrology, deed boundaries, water rights, historical infrastructure. Every page felt heavier now, more urgent, more alive. The truth was no longer just ink and paper. It was a lifeline for the valley, a chain linking my grandfather's work to every rancher downstream. I opened Sarah's last message. "Tomorrow we submit the preliminary report to the State Water Board. Get some rest. We're just getting started." I folded the phone shut and looked again at the map of the lake pinned beneath my elbow. They had reshaped a shoreline, destroyed a monitoring station, built a marina over protected water, and yet they believed the land would protect them. But land doesn't protect people who violate it. It remembers. Silently, patiently. And eventually, it speaks. I sat back in my chair, listening to the distant rush of the wind through the eaves. Tomorrow, the state would hear about this lake. Tomorrow, the first real crack in their false foundation would appear. And when it did, the entire valley would feel the shift. The morning rose sharp and clear, the kind of Wyoming cold that made every board in the cabin pop and settle like the house itself was waking up with a groan. I'd barely slept, running through documents in my mind, flowcharts, survey overlays, old maps from my grandfather's files. Logic told me I'd done everything I could. Instinct told me today would change everything. Sarah called before the sun even crested the ridge. "You ready?" she asked, her voice crisp, steadier than mine felt. "As ready as I can be." "I filed the preliminary report 3 minutes ago," she said. "State Water Resources has officially opened an investigation. They'll be contacting Sheriff Hale for site access and documentation." Good. Finally, something official pushing back. But the weight of it wasn't just relief. It was the quiet tremor of inevitability. Once the state stepped in, there was no undoing it. No more polite meetings, no more community drama. This was real now. I hung up, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside just as my phone buzzed again, this time a text from Marcus. "HOA holding an emergency meeting at noon. You should be there, and bring the paperwork." Snowmelt dripped steadily off the cabin roof, each drop hitting the dirt with a faint tap. Somewhere across the valley, a hawk cried, a long, lonely sound that carried across the lake like a warning. I climbed into the truck and drove. The HOA clubhouse sat perched on a ridge overlooking the marina. It looked smaller today, less impressive now that I knew how fragile its foundation really was. Cars packed the gravel lot, most of them spotless SUVs with out-of-state plates, a couple work trucks scattered among them like stubborn reminders that this valley wasn't meant for gated communities and decorative lakeside living. As I stepped out, conversations hushed. People turned, whispered. That was new. They weren't angry today. They were anxious. Marcus stood near the entrance, arms folded, hat pulled low. He nodded at me in a way that said we'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Inside, the tension clung to the air like humidity. The meeting room was full. Residents packed shoulder to shoulder, some standing along the walls, others gripping cups of coffee with white knuckles. A few folks lifted their phones to record, pretending it was casual. Bethany Reed stood at the front, flanked by two HOA board members. Her hair was perfectly pinned, her blazer crisp, but something in her face had changed. Less confidence, more calculation. Her eyes landed on me, and for the first time since I'd met her, she blinked. "Mr. Cole," she said, smoothing her voice into something polite but strained. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending." "I was invited," I said, nodding toward Marcus. She smiled tightly. "Well, this is an HOA meeting. Only residents are—" "Actually," Marcus interrupted, his tone peaceful in a way that meant danger. "I'm here in my capacity as county sheriff, and this meeting concerns a matter under active review by the state. So he's not only allowed, he's necessary." A murmur rippled across the room. Bethany lifted her chin, but the tremor in her jaw betrayed her. She cleared her throat. "We're here to discuss a situation that has arisen. Mr. Cole has made certain accusations regarding our boundaries, our infrastructure, and our water usage." Accusations. A tidy little word for theft and fraud. She continued, "These claims paint us as irresponsible, even criminal. But I assure you, our survey is legitimate, our improvements legal, and our community built on land openly recognized by county officials." I stepped forward. "County officials like your brother-in-law?" Gasps fluttered through the room. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at Bethany with sudden scrutiny. She stiffened. "Personal attacks aren't helpful, Mr. Cole." "No," I said, pulling out a folder, "but facts are." I laid out the original 1960s water rights certificate, the 1993 deed, the hydrology map, the county-stamped survey that matched my grandfather's boundaries, and finally, the comparison of the HOA's altered shoreline. People leaned in, really leaned in, as if the papers themselves were whispering secrets. Bethany's face flushed. "This proves nothing," she said sharply. "Maps shift, land erodes, boundaries are updated all the time." "Sure," I said, "and sometimes they're updated illegally." She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the double doors swung open. A man in a gray jacket stepped inside, holding a thin black folder. He wore a badge on his belt. Not a county badge, a state badge. "Morning," he said. He introduced himself as a representative from the Wyoming Water Resources Department. Every voice fell silent. "We've received a formal complaint regarding alteration of a state-recognized water system," he said. "We're here to conduct an immediate preliminary review of the Lakeshore Pines development." Bethany's lips parted, but no sound came out. The investigator opened his folder. "Our records show that this lake feeds irrigation channels to 3 ranches, provides runoff for part of the valley, and includes a spillway built in 1964 under state oversight." He glanced at the crowd. "Any modification to that infrastructure requires explicit approval." He turned to Bethany. "You did not file for approval." Her cheeks drained of color. "That's impossible," she said. "Our contractor handled—" The investigator cut her off gently but firmly. "Your contractor never submitted documentation, and your HOA's construction has obstructed part of the spillway." People murmured in alarm. I watched the room whirl with confusion and dawning anger. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about water, about ranching families who depended on this lake for survival. It was about the valley itself. The investigator continued. "Additionally, we've received evidence that an original monitoring station was demolished without proper filing. That alone is a violation." Bethany swallowed hard. "There must be a misunderstanding." Marcus stepped forward, voice steady. "There's no misunderstanding. I took the photos myself." The investigator nodded slowly. "As of now, per state authority, the marina is suspended. All HOA development involving water access is frozen until our review is complete. The room erupted. Questions, anger, panic. The polished veneer of the HOA began to fracture, splintering like ice under pressure. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When their shouting softened, I spoke clearly. You didn't just build over my land. You built over a water system my grandfather protected for half a century. You didn't just steal property. You stole the lifeblood of this valley. People stared at me, not with hostility, but with something new. Recognition, fear, understanding. Bethany clutched the edge of the podium like she needed it to stay standing. You can't prove intent, she whispered. I held her gaze. I don't have to. The state will. Marcus stepped beside me, his presence solid as bedrock. The investigator closed his folder. And just like that, the tide shifted. From that moment forward, the HOA wasn't fighting me. They were fighting the truth, the law, the valley. The lake was never theirs, and now everyone finally knew it. The next 48 hours moved like weather sweeping down from the Tetons. Slow at first, then fast enough to rattle windows. Word spread across the valley quicker than wildfire gossip. The state was investigating Lakeshore Pines. The marina was frozen, and the HOA president had been blindsided in her own meeting. By the time noon rolled around the following day, every truck pull-off, gas station, and diner counter in 2 counties had some version of the story. Most were wrong, a few were close, and maybe 2 or 3 actually got the details right. But the part people understood, really understood, was simple. They built on the wrong damn land. I wasn't looking for attention, but once the state stepped in, attention found me. Strangers stopped me at the feed store. Folks I hadn't seen since high school knocked on my cabin door, some to offer support, some to ask what it all meant for their irrigation lines. But the HOA? They didn't stay quiet. They doubled down. At 7 that morning, a message hit every resident's inbox and phone. A mass HOA announcement dripping with blame, denial, and just enough half-truth to sound official. A disgruntled outsider is attempting to destabilize our community. All allegations are being handled internally. Residents are encouraged to stand united against false claims. They even attached their doctored survey map again, as if a PDF could outrun the state of Wyoming. By 10, I got another text. Not from Sarah, not from Marcus, but from a resident named Donna who'd been polite but cautious at the meeting. You'd better come. Bethany called a full board session. It's about you. So I went. The clubhouse, once a symbol of pride, now looked like a stage where someone was losing control of the script. People crowded inside, talking in low, tense voices. The windows facing the lake cast pale light across the long meeting table, illuminating stacks of paper, binders, and a projector already humming. Bethany Reed stood at the front. Her hair was pulled so tight it looked painful. Her expression had the polished shine of someone pretending they were still in charge, just a little too bright at the edges, like enamel cracking under heat. Beside her, Jake Mercer leaned against the wall with his hands in his pockets, scanning the room like a man taking inventory of a challenge he still believed he could win. I walked in and the room reacted. Some people shifted away. Some nodded. Some stared like they were trying to reconcile everything they'd learned in the last 24 hours. Bethany's eyes locked on me, sharp, controlled, trembling just beneath the surface. "Mr. Cole," she said, "glad you could join us." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The folder in my hand spoke for me. She tapped the projector remote. A glowing slide appeared on the screen. A list of discrepancies she claimed proved the state's inquiry was misguided. She spoke fast, talking over anyone who tried to ask a question. "Lakeshore Pines is fully compliant," she insisted. "Our survey is recognized by the county. Our infrastructure was approved. This so-called deed dispute is a misunderstanding. And as far as state water issues, our marina adjusts the shoreline by less than 2%. That's irrelevant to resource regulations. Jake nodded slightly, as if those words were rehearsed. I let her talk. I let her run the rope all the way out. Then Sarah slipped quietly into the room and stood beside me, a thin stack of documents in her arms. Bethany kept going, voice rising, pointing at charts and photos and clipped-out emails. But the more she spoke, the more restless the residents became. Some whispered, some frowned deeply. I watched their shoulders tighten, watched doubt creep in behind their eyes. Finally, one woman raised a trembling hand. "Why didn't you tell us about the water system?" she asked. Bethany froze. "What water system?" "The investigator said this lake feeds the valley. My brother's ranch uses that line." Her voice cracked. "Did you know about that?" A few murmurs rose like a shifting tide. Bethany swallowed. "That's not part of HOA jurisdiction." "You built a marina on top of it," someone else said. "You blocked a spillway," another added. "It's right there in the photos." Bethany's voice sharpened, brittle as glass. "Those claims are exaggerated. We've followed county guidance at every step." "County guidance like your brother-in-law?" a man said from the back. Silence fell so fast, it felt like the air thickened. Jake pushed off the wall, stepping forward. "All right, let's get something straight. This development brought value to the valley. Jobs, foot traffic, property uplift. Without us, this area would still be a forgotten patch of land collecting dust and dead pine needles." I turned halfway toward him. "It wasn't forgotten. It was owned." Jake smirked. "Then someone should have been taking care of it." I stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "My grandfather did. For 50 years. You paved over his work." Bethany's voice cracked as she tried to redirect the room. "Let's move on. This meeting is not an interrogation." But the room was already shifting, pivoting toward me like a slow-turning compass needle. People were done being told what to think. Sarah exhaled softly beside me and opened her folder. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but undeniably firm. "We have documentation that needs to be acknowledged." Bethany's jaw clenched. "You weren't invited to speak." "Good thing legality doesn't run on invitations," Sarah said. And then she placed the papers on the table, one set at a time, in clean, deliberate movements. Deed. Survey overlays. Water rights. State filings. Hydrological maps. Photos of construction over the spillway. Approval stamps signed by Bethany's brother-in-law. Each sheet landing like a weight, or a blow, or a verdict already forming. Residents pressed closer, reading silently. The soft shuffle of paper sounded like snow falling. Someone whispered, "My God, this is real." Sarah didn't raise her voice, didn't get emotional. She simply laid out the facts, crisp, undeniable. "These documents were submitted to the state yesterday," she said. "They are part of an official investigation. And every signature, every coordinate, every timestamp matches the claim that this land, this lake, belongs to Remy Cole." Bethany's breath hitched. Jake's shoulders tightened. A man near the front turned to them, his face pale. "You told us everything was cleared. You told us the property was abandoned." "It was abandoned," Bethany snapped, desperation seeping through her tone. "Nobody lived here for decades." I shook my head. "Abandonment is a legal term, and nothing about this land was abandoned. Taxes were paid. Surveys were filed. Boundaries recorded. My grandfather gave this valley water. You gave it paperwork." A woman with silver hair looked at Bethany with tears in her eyes. "Did you know the owner was alive when you started this?" Bethany's lips trembled. I acted within the county's guidance," Someone else interrupted, voice harsh and shaking. No, you acted within your own. The dam broke. Not literally, God forbid, but emotionally. The room cracked wide open. Questions turned into accusations. Accusations turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into anger, not directed at me, not anymore, at her. Bethany slammed both palms on the table. This meeting is over. But the room didn't move. No one stood. No one followed her authority. Control had left her hands the second the truth hit wood, and she knew it. She stormed out, Jake following, muttering curses under his breath. The door slammed with an echo that felt like a chapter closing, even though the story was far from finished. When they were gone, the residents turned to me, some apologetic, some fearful, some trying to understand where this left them. But for the first time, they looked at me not as a threat, but as the one person who had been telling the truth all along. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the moment you feel the earth shift beneath your boots and know it's shifting in your favor. The papers had hit the table, and nothing would be the same. 3 weeks later, winter swept down from the northern ridge like a living thing, cold, decisive, stripping the last of the golden leaves from the cottonwoods. The lake, once restless with boat wakes from the HOA marina, now lay quiet, glassy, untouched. The state shutdown order held strong, and for the first time in years, the water seemed to breathe. I wished I could do the same, because today was the hearing, not the final trial, not the sentencing, but the one moment that could determine whether the judge would freeze all HOA activity, recognize the original boundaries, and formally acknowledge my ownership, pending trial. A hinge point, a pivot, a day where the truth either took root or got buried deeper. I arrived at the courthouse early, the kind of early that gives you a moment to sit in your truck and gather yourself. Frost feathered across the windshield. My thermos steamed on the dash. The deed lay open on the passenger seat, the same deed my grandfather had kept folded so many times the creases had turned into soft white lines. I touched it gently, like the paper itself carried his handprint. You ready for this? A familiar voice asked. Sarah stood outside the truck, wrapped in a dark coat, hair pulled back, eyes sharp. She didn't look nervous. Sarah never looked nervous. She looked prepared. As ready as I can be, I said, stepping out. We have everything we need, she said quietly. The judge is known for sticking to facts, not emotions, not persuasion. Facts. Good. Because facts were something Bethany and Jake couldn't spin today. People had already gathered near the steps, residents from Lakeshore Pines, some clutching folders, some whispering, some glaring. Not at me anymore. At each other. At the board. At the mess they were suddenly realizing they'd been part of. Then the HOA SUVs rolled up like a parade nobody asked for. Out stepped Bethany in a navy suit that didn't quite hide the tremor in her hands, and Jake Mercer in a tailored coat that screamed money and denial. Their legal team followed, 4 attorneys in charcoal suits, each carrying thick binders meant to look intimidating. Marcus arrived next, hat low, jacket zipped high against the cold. He nodded to me with a small, grounding sort of gesture, one that told me I wasn't walking into this room alone. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood, paper, and heat from the vents. The benches creaked as residents filed in. Some leaned forward, elbows on knees. Others clutched their coats like armor. Everyone knew this day mattered. The bailiff announced the judge. She entered with the calm weight of someone who'd seen every possible version of human conflict. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, glasses perched halfway down her nose, eyes sharp as mountain frost. Good morning, she said. We are here to hear arguments on preliminary injunction regarding property boundaries, water infrastructure, and unauthorized development. We all stood, then sat. The sound of 100 people shifting wood and fabric echoed like a soft wave. Sarah rose. "Your Honor," she began, stepping to the podium, "I will demonstrate through deed records, survey comparisons, hydrological maps, and sworn statements that my client, Remy Cole, is the lawful owner of the land on which the Lakeshore Pines development sits. Furthermore, we will show evidence of deliberate boundary manipulation, unauthorized construction on a state-regulated water system, and fraudulent filings." Her voice was steady, controlled, sharp enough to cut steel. She clicked the first slide onto the court screen. The original 1993 deed, my grandfather's name, the boundaries clear as a winter sky. Whispers rippled behind me. Next slide. The HOA's 2018 survey, shifted 200 feet south, as cleanly and suspiciously as a missing puzzle piece. Then came the water rights certificate from 1960, the spillway map, the state's letter confirming unauthorized interference. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "please clarify the timeline of acquisition and development." Sarah did, in crisp detail. When she was done, the judge turned to the defense. "Your response." The lead HOA attorney approached with the swagger of someone used to steamrolling small-town disputes. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this case is being blown far out of proportion by an individual who seeks to displace an entire community out of personal greed. Lakeshore Pines purchased this land in good faith. Our survey was accepted by the county, and our residents, families, have built their lives there." Emotion. Deflection. A smokescreen his client had relied on for years. The judge didn't blink. "Address the documents," she said, "not the sentiment." He hesitated just long enough for the room to feel it. Then Sarah stepped forward again. "We anticipated that argument, Your Honor." She played the recording. Bethany's voice filled the courtroom. "We formalized what was already the reality on the ground. The old boundaries were outdated, and we moved fast before heirs surfaced." You could have heard a pine needle drop. Bethany's face drained of color. Jake stared at the floor. A few residents gasped. One woman covered her mouth. The judge listened with no visible reaction, just a tightening around her jaw. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Ms. Reed, did you or did you not have knowledge of a valid, recorded deed at the time of development?" Bethany stood slowly. Her attorney put a hand on her arm, whispering something. She pulled away. Her voice cracked. "I may have been aware of historical filings." Sarah raised a single finger. "Your Honor, may we enter Exhibit 14? The judge nodded. Sarah handed the bailiff the email, the one from 2018, the one that mentioned my grandfather by name, and his death, and the narrow window. The judge read it silently. Then she closed the folder and looked at me. "Mr. Cole, please stand." I did. She turned to the courtroom, voice steady, firm, unflinching. "The evidence is clear. The court grants the preliminary injunction. All HOA development is suspended. All operations on the disputed land are prohibited. The marina shall remain closed. The HOA is barred from altering or removing any documents or infrastructure." Bethany swayed where she stood. Jake's hands balled into fists. Residents whispered, some relieved, some stunned, some furious at the woman who had led them here. Then the judge delivered the words that cracked the last piece of their foundation. "This court finds sufficient cause to refer the matter for criminal investigation into potential fraud, trespass, and official misconduct. Depositions will begin within 14 days. It was quiet. Not the stunned quiet of disbelief. Not the angry quiet of tension. The quiet of truth finally landing. The quiet of a lie collapsing under its own weight. I sat down slowly, palms warm, heartbeat steady. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let the weight lift, piece by piece, like something heavy finally sliding off my shoulders. The hearing ended. People rose. Voices rose. Papers rustled. Doors opened. As Bethany walked past me, eyes hollow, she whispered, "You've ruined everything." I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "I just stopped you from ruining anything else." Marcus met me at the back of the courtroom. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said. Maybe. Maybe not yet. But for the first time since I arrived at that cursed gate, I felt the faint, undeniable warmth of something I'd nearly forgotten. Justice. Winter settled in fully by the time the final judgment came down. Snow stacked on the pine boughs, soft and heavy, muting each sound until the entire valley felt wrapped in cotton. The lake, once choked by wake trails and motor noise, now lay still beneath a thin sheet of ice, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror that couldn't be lied to anymore. I stood alone on the bank that morning, boots half buried in the frozen mud, watching the water breathe beneath its glassy skin. The sheriff's caution tape still fluttered on the old HOA gate up the hill, a thin yellow line cutting through the white landscape like a reminder of what had been taken, and then taken back. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a short text from Sarah. Judgment finalized. Restitution cleared. It's over. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the quiet right after a storm, a right earned inch by inch, document by document, truth by truth. The judge's ruling had been firm, almost merciful in its clarity. The HOA dissolved. Bethany convicted on multiple counts. Jake barred from future development in the county. The 47 families compensated by restitution, not from me, but from the fraud that targeted them. My ownership recognized in full. Every illegal structure subject to removal or renegotiation. The law had spoken louder than any HOA meeting ever could. I turned and walked up the slope toward the old foundation. My grandfather's cabin, or what was left of it. Just a rectangle of concrete softened by moss and snow, edges cracked from decades of Wyoming freeze-thaw. I knelt, brushing away powder to reveal the worn surface beneath. He'd stood here once, boots planted in freshly poured concrete, looking out at the same lake I was looking at now. The same mountains, the same wind curling through the pines, and somewhere deep in the sound of that wind, I felt something settle inside me. Something old, something steady. Behind me, a vehicle approached slowly. When I stood, a woman in her 60s stepped out, one of the residents who'd chosen to stay. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets and made her way toward me, boots crunching in the snow. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not at all." She stood beside me, breathing in the cold air. "It's beautiful," she said, "even more now that it's quiet again." "It was always meant to be quiet," I replied. She nodded. "I wanted to say thank you, not just for everything you fought for, but for how you handled all this. You could have pushed us all out. You could have torn everything down. Most people would have." "I'm not most people," I said softly. She smiled, eyes shining a little. "No, you're not." We stood in silence, looking out at the lake as a breeze rippled across the thin ice, fracturing the reflection of the clouded sky. "I signed the new lease," she said. 20 years. It's fair, more than fair." "I'm glad," I answered. "This land has room for people who respect it. Always has." She left after a while, her footsteps fading into the hush of the snow. I remained on the ridge, alone again, but no longer hollow. Later that afternoon, I drove down to the old HOA gate, the same one that had stopped me on my first day here. The wood was weathered, The hinges rusted. The yellow tape flapped gently in the wind like a flag of surrender. I gripped the gate with both hands and lifted. It groaned, wobbled, then gave way, falling back into the snow with a heavy thud that echoed down the empty road. The path to the lake opened wide, untouched from here on out. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, washing the ice in pale gold, I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. The photograph I'd carried all these weeks. My grandfather standing in this very spot, younger, stronger, his eyes bright with the pride of a man who understood what legacy truly meant. On the back, written in fading pencil, were 4 words. Land is legacy kept. I breathed out slowly. I didn't take anything from them, I said aloud, to the still valley. I just took it back. The wind moved through the pines in answer, soft, deep, familiar, and the land, at long last, remembered who protected it. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning, it's about reminding the world what's worth protecting. If you've ever fought for your home or your peace, drop a justice in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, feel free to subscribe and ride along with us for the next fight out here on the open land.